Hello everyone, this is going to be a YouTube video about oligopolies and game theory. You can use this YouTube video to help you complete the 4.5 guided notes in independent practice. And so let's get into it. And so we've been talking a lot about market settings, and I introduced you to the final market setting that we're going to use in this class called oligopolies. And we kind of used I stole this example from Khan Academy because I thought he explained it in a very interesting way, where we essentially have two axes, two qualities that we're going to use to kind of differentiate, pun intended, the different market settings that we've been working with in this class. And so our first market setting that we had was perfect competition. We said that there are expectations, or a series of expectations that we have about profits, long-run profits in a perfectly competitive market, and conditions that we said that yield a perfectly competitive market. And we kind of realized that the perfect competitive market was an extreme that exists more in economist streams, but nonetheless we use extremes in economics to understand the reality that exists between them. And in a perfectly competitive market, one of the conditions that gives rise to a perfectly competitive market is identical products and a lot of firms. And so we situated the perfectly competitive market on this diagram here at the other extreme of the monopoly market. And on this other axis here, we can see differentiation, and we're talking about product differentiation. And so we can see very low differentiation because they're identical products. And then, of course, at the other extreme is a monopoly, right? A number of firms in that market, there's just one because it's a monopoly. And again, low differentiation because they're selling the same good. And then we talked about monopolistic competition. We said advertising is important in monopolistic competition. We said that in monopolistic competition, we have low barriers to entry. A lot of different firms are producing similar goods, but not quite. There may be some differentiation at play, and firms, of course, want to differentiate their products from other products because they want to ensure the demand curves for their products are more inelastic. So there's a lot of advertising in these types of markets, as there possibly is in oligopolistic markets. But there are fundamentally low barriers to entry. And then finally, the last market setting that we have is oligopolies. We said that these products and services tend to be not as differentiated as compared to monopolistic competition, but oligopolies are going to be much more concentrated markets because there are large barriers to entry. There's probably a huge fixed cost that needs to be paid to enter this type of market. And there's generally going to be very few firms. Classic oligopolies are like the airline industry or automakers. So we have the definition of oligopoly right there. It's a market with small group of firms competing with each other, with large barriers to entry. And then here's where game theory comes into play. Game theory was developed by economists, and it can help us understand firm behavior, right, in market settings, in imperfect market settings, in perfectly competitive market settings. But I would contend game theory has much more, well, I'm not the only one that would contend this. Game theory has much more wide application beyond this class, right? Game theory is the study of strategic situations, which are refers to outcomes that affect you, depend on your actions and someone else's actions. Fundamentally, game theory can help us think about how firms and businesses specifically behave when we're specifically thinking about microeconomics in scenarios in which they are interdependent, in which their profits or payoffs are contingent upon what other players in the game or what other firms do that are making similar products. But game theory has wider application. You can use game theory to think about a range of strategic situations, from dating to nuclear arms control to climate change, etc. And this is probably because the ingredients of a game are pretty simple. You just need players, strategies, and payoffs. So in class, we use this example. Well, I showed you the Steeler split example, where they were playing a variant of the prisoner's dilemma with where one strategy was weakly dominated, or one strategy was weakly dominant, I should say. And forget about the definition of that for now. I think I discussed it a little bit in class and referred to how the variation of the prisoner's dilemma in the Steeler split game leads to less predictability than the prisoner's dilemma games that I'm going to be building for you in this class, and that we're going to be working with a lot in this class. And so here's a classic prisoner's dilemma, and we have two players. We have player number 1 and player number 2. I should start by saying that how we're going to represent strategic interactions in this class is through a 2x2. Of course, there are usually more players in a game and more players in Oligopoly specifically. But nonetheless, just for this class, we're going to use this stylized 2x2 payoff matrix format to represent strategic interactions. And we can still develop intuitions about oligopolistic markets and about the world and fascinating intuitions, even though we're only using, just the tip of the iceberg type of analytic tools that game theory can provide for us. And so how we're going to represent this is we're going to have player number 1 over here, and we're going to list their 2 strategies, confess and stay silent. And player number 2 is silent and confess. Okay. Player number 2 is silent and confess. Hold on, let me make sure I set up this game appropriately. Oh yes, I did. Player number 2 strategies are silent and confess. And so we went over this example in class, or the background behind this example in class. There are 2 bank robbers, they get caught, they get taken to separate holding cells, and the police are trying to coerce or persuade the other person to confess. Really, if both confess, that would be good as well for the police. And if one confesses, these payoffs are going to represent years. And sometimes payoff, if they're in like dollar figures, you want to maximize your payoffs, but this reflects years in prison. So obviously, we're going to assume these players want to minimize the years in prison. So minimize, well, I guess maximize their payoffs, but minimize the amount of years in prison. And so if one player stays silent and the other confesses, then we end up in a situation in which, well, let's just go through this game, right? So if player number 1, the row player is always going to be represented by the first number, and the column player is always going to be represented by the second number. So we can see the payoff. If player 1 confesses, then if player 1 confesses, then player 2 will get 10 years in prison. Right, so if player 1 confesses, player 2 will get 10 years in prison if they confess. And if player 1 confesses, player 2 will get 25 years in prison if they confess. If they stay silent, sorry. I don't know why I'm having trouble. I think it's just because it's a Friday and I spent a lot of time with 6th graders today, so I am very tired. And then if player 1 stays silent, I have spent a lot of time with 6th graders because I'm helping them test. And player 1 stays silent. Then if player 2 confesses, their payoff is going to be 1 year. Right, so that would probably be the most favorable outcome for player 2. And if player 1 stays silent and player 2 stays silent, then player 2 is going to go to prison for 3 years. All right, so if they both confess, they're both going to go to prison for 10 years. If they both stay silent, 3 years. And if one stays silent and one defects or confesses, then respectively 1 year and 25 years. Or actually not respectively. The person that stays silent gets 25 years in prison, and the person that confesses gets 1 year in prison. Okay, and so this is a prisoner's dilemma. And to sort of predict what's going to happen in this sort of prisoner's dilemma, we can use this kind of tools, this vocabulary of dominant strategy and Nash equilibrium. Move this back a little bit. We can use this strategy of dominant, or this vocabulary of dominant strategy and Nash equilibrium. So a dominant strategy is a strategy a player has a dominant strategy when they have one course of action that outperforms all others no matter what other players do. It's going to lead to outcomes that are better in some eventualities, but not worse in any. And a Nash equilibrium is going to be a point at which no player wants to change their actions given what others have done. Okay, and no player wants to change their actions given what others have done. All right, so if we're going to play this game, we got to search for dominant strategies. And the way that we search for dominant strategies is we think about the best possible payoff, assuming that eliminating one strategy of another player. So we're going to find the best possible payoff for player one, assuming that player two is going to play confess, right? So we can actually hold our hand over this second row, right? So if player one has to choose between confess and stay silent, let's try to maximize their payoffs or minimize the amount of years that they spend in jail. Well, and we're assuming player two confesses. Their best payoff for player one is going to be 10 years, right? It's going to be here. It's going their best strategy, or their best response to player two choosing confess is going to be 10 years. And then likewise, we can do the same logic. Let's look for player one's best response, now covering this row and assuming that player two stays silent. Well, the best response for player one is going to confess as well. And we can see player one's payoff is only 1 year in prison. If these two circles align, right? If these two circles take place, or these two circles, with these two circles, we found a dominant strategy, right? And the dominant strategy for player one is to confess, because it reflects a scenario in which a player has let me actually get a more technical definition, because I think this might actually be more helpful, more game theoretic type of definition. And so one way we can think about it is that the payoffs, or we can think about the strategy to confess for player number one strictly dominates the player number one strategy to remain silent, because the payoffs from the strategy of confessing are strictly greater, right? I mean, lower numbers of years in prison, but that's considered a greater payoff than that from remaining silent, regardless of what player two does, right? Everyone can see that. So player one's dominant strategy is to confess, right? Because independent of what player two does, 10 is less than 25 years in prison, and 1 is less than 3 years in prison. And then we do the same type of analysis. Let's find the best response player two can come up with if we eliminate this strategy from player one's handbook. So if we're assuming player one confesses, well, the best response for player number one, we can circle the payoff, is going to be 10. And then the best response for player number two. And then we can put a hand in front of confess and try to find the best response for player number two, assuming player number one is playing the silent strategy. Well, then the best response for player number one, or player number two, is to confess as well, right? And so we have a situation in which both players have a dominant strategy. And since both players have a dominant strategy, I'll give you a sort of rule. As long as there's one dominant strategy in a game, we can find a Nash equilibrium. We can find a situation at which no player wants to change their actions given what the other has done. We can find a situation in which the player's strategy is the best response to the other player's strategy that they're playing, right? Where there's no incentive to deviate, holding the other person's actions constant, right? And so this is a Nash equilibrium. This is going to be the Nash equilibrium of the prisoner's dilemma. And what's interesting here is that this is probably the third, player number one would probably rank this as the third best outcome for them, right? The worst outcome for player number one would probably be a situation in which they stay silent and they get 25 years in prison. And the worst outcome for player number two would be a situation in which they stay silent and the other confesses and they get 25 years in prison, right? So this is the third best outcome and the second worst outcome for these players. But it's a Nash equilibrium for the prisoner's dilemma, right? And it's reasonable to expect that if these players actually played this game, this is where we would arrive. It's also the point at which both players don't have an incentive to deviate, right? There's going to be no regrets, like hashtag no regrets. At a Nash equilibrium, hashtag there's no regrets, right? And we can think about it. If the player finds out that the other confesses, right? If player number one finds out that the other confesses, they're not going to regret their strategy because they're going to say, I'm not going to regret it because my other strategy would just to be silent and I would be worse off, right? I would spend 25 years in prison. And the same logic holds for player number two. So at a Nash equilibrium, there's no regrets of the strategy that is played, right? And so this would be exactly here. Now, even though this is probably the outcome that is best for both of them, the second best outcome for player number one and the second best outcome for player number two, the cooperative best outcome, I should say, too, there is an incentive to deviate, right? Player number one, if they find out after the police come to them and say, well, the other person stayed silent and you stayed silent, so you're both getting 3 years in prison, player number one might say to himself or herself or theirself that, oh, maybe I should have, just confessed and ensured that the other person, and I would only get 1 year in prison, right? There's always an incentive to deviate at situations that are not Nash equilibriums, right? And then the way our analysis, right, since where this is kind of a non-mathy type thing, but our analysis where we were doing these type of circles, right? If you get two circles, right, in a square, that's your Nash equilibrium. That's the point at which no player wants to change their actions given what the other has done, right? So holding the other player's strategy is fixed. There's no incentive to deviate, right? Okay, so that's the Nash equilibrium of this game, and it's reasonable to expect that players would arrive at this Nash equilibrium. It's a pretty good prediction. But this is a prisoner's dilemma, right? This is a prisoner's dilemma. It's an interesting game. That's why it's chosen. But there's prisoner's dilemmas everywhere, right? And hopefully it allows us to develop this intuition behind why cooperation is so, it can be so difficult. And especially in oligopolistic markets, cooperation can be so difficult and break down. And so we're going to do some other examples. I'm going to drag you over here. And so here's an OPEC example. So we talked about OPEC in class. This stands for oil, petroleum, and exporting countries. They're essentially a cartel. Cartels are unlawful in the United States. There are antitrust laws, laws that prevent firms from colluding with other firms. But nonetheless, of course, firms still do this. But we use game theory to think about firm behavior especially in oligopolistic markets, when they're more concentrated markets, there's a greater probability that collusion can take place. But there's also, and expectedly, breakdowns in cooperation, right? And this prisoner's dilemma can provide us a kind of analytic tool for understanding why those breakdowns can occur. And so here we have a 2x2. Obviously, there's greater than 2 countries in OPEC. And so OPEC was pretty successful in the 70s at raising the price of oil by restricting production, oil production. So they would set production targets, and they restricted they artificially raised the price of oil and increased their profits. And so if firms behave, oligopolistic firms have an opportunity to behave and therefore get the markup of a monopoly or move towards that if they cooperate with one another. But of course, cooperation can break down because there's going to be an incentive to defect. And we can use this prisoner's dilemma to help us think about that incentive to defect. And so in this example, I'm going to say that Iran and Iraq have two, and this is a stylized example, and we can see the incentive to defect in a 2x2 example. So imagine if you had even more players to the game, then you would kind of understand the sort of incentive that exists to defect. And so we can have a sort of 2x2, and we can say that the 2 and 4 represent strategies the players of the game can choose. They can either choose to pick 2 million barrels or 4 million barrels. Again, this is such a simplification, right? But we can imagine in reality that incentive to defect is possibly greater. So we have Iran can choose to produce 2 million barrels or 4 million barrels, and Iraq can choose to produce 2 million or 4 million, and then these are the respective payoffs. The column numbers, I kind of tried to show you that the first number always represents the row players' payoffs, and the second number represents the column players' payoffs. These numbers in this payoff matrix are going to be in millions of profits. So 46 million in profits, 42 million, 26 million, 44 million, 52 million, 22 million, 32 million, and 24 million. And to solve this game, to find the Nash equilibrium, the point at which no player wants to change their actions, the point at which no player would have a regret, at which the player would be playing, in theory, the best response to the other player's strategy, or each player, I should say, would be playing the best response to the other player, player's strategy. That's a good way to put it. I don't think I articulated that earlier. And then, so let's see, and let's do the same type of analysis. So let's restrict Iraq's strategy options and say Iraq chooses to produce 2 million barrels. What's going to yield the greatest number of payoffs for Iran, which is the column player? Well, it's going to be producing 4 million barrels, 44 million barrels, I should say. Or producing 4 million barrels so they can get a profit of 44, which is greater than 42. And then what if Iraq chooses to produce 4 million barrels? Well, 24 is greater than 22, so right here. The difference why the profit structures are different, I stole this from a game theory textbook, was that the cost of production may be different for different countries, right? So kind of adding a little bit of a layer of complexity to this stylized game. And so we can see right away that Iran has a dominant strategy. And I suppose if there's one recommendation in game theory is to play your dominant strategy. So Iran will likely play their dominant strategy. And Iraq, we shall see, or if we cover the column players option and assume Iran plays 2, what is going to be the biggest payoff for Iraq? Well, it's going to produce 4 million barrels. And if we assume Oh, what do I do? Yeah. So let's cover this strategy profile. What is going to be the biggest payoff for Iraq? It's going to be to produce 4 million barrels. 32 is greater than 26. And we see we have a Nash equilibrium. This is a situation, this Nash equilibrium is a situation in which each player is playing the best response to the other player's strategy. It's also a situation in which there is no regrets. There's no incentive to defect. There would have been regrets at this situation, as we can see, right? If we arrived at this situation where Iran is producing 4 million barrels and Iraq is producing 2 million barrels, Iraq would obviously get upset, and there's incentive to defect, right? There's an incentive sort of pulling towards the Nash equilibrium, a desire to have there's a regret. There's a desire that, oh, I wish that I would have produced 4 million barrels. And maybe if this game is iterated, meaning played repeatedly, maybe Iraq will produce 4 million barrels. So we can see Iran has a dominant strategy and Iraq has a dominant strategy. And so these games are the simplest to solve. It's pretty easy to find a Nash equilibrium if one player has a dominant strategy. And if both players have a dominant strategy, then the game is very easy to solve. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why prisoners' dilemmas arise before we go through like other applications of game theory, and specifically the prisoner's dilemma. Well, they arrive in asymmetric cases where one-sided cooperation is the most costly option, which we can see, right? Where one-sided defection is the most beneficial option, where two-sided defection is somewhat costly, and where two-sided cooperation is somewhat beneficial. So I want you to take some time, pause the video if you need to, and kind of mull over what these ideas are trying to articulate. Okay. Sorry, I'm just making sure that I have everything that I wanted to articulate for you in this video prepared. Right, so games with two dominant strategies are pretty easy. Because each player is just going to choose their dominant strategy. Now let's look about games, well, if the player is rational. Let's look about other types of games that also have prisoners' dilemmas in them. So this is an example. This is the security dilemma. And we always have to have payoffs. So I'm going to, this is going to be a nuclear disarmament type of problem. And the US has two options, to arm or disarm, and Russia has two options, to arm or disarm. And the numbers are going to represent utils, or utils, I don't know, utils, like from the word utility. And it's trying to reflect this idea that the US's best, I suppose, option would be a scenario in which they get to keep their arms just in case, and Russia is forced to disarm. Right? That's where they're going to have that's their best case scenario. And Russia's best case scenario is a situation in which they get to keep their arms and the United States disarms. And so with the security dilemma, what makes this so interesting and fascinating is, well, first of all, it's such a core feature of undergraduate teaching, or I should say instruction in international relations. And was a core part of my curriculum as an international politics major at Georgetown. But what's interesting about the prisoner's dilemma is that you don't even need like the other elements to sort of see where, like, you don't even need like political ideologies or like differences between countries, or to add extra variables to the game, I should say. Like, you don't even need differences between domestic political systems to sort of see that you could arrive at a situation in which even two countries where the domestic political leadership doesn't necessarily want to behave in an aggressive fashion towards the other country, appears to behave in an aggressive fashion towards the other country by keeping their arms, right? Maybe what I'm trying to get at is maybe the United States and Russia aren't necessarily militaristic. Both countries do have very militaristic cultures, though, in my opinion. But end up at the situation in which they just want to keep their arms just in case, because of the potential for or the want or desire to deter potentially malign actors from interfering with their sovereignty. Okay, so we have here two strategies, and we can see that the Nash equilibrium that we arrive at is going to be here, where both countries arm. We would do the same sort of analysis covering what would be Russia's best response, arm or disarm. If the United States chose to disarm, their best response would be to obviously arm, right? Because that's where they get the highest payoffs, the most utility. What would be Russia's best response to the US choosing to arm? Obviously, if they disarmed, they would have negative utility, so it might be 0. And these numbers are completely arbitrary. You can put in a different set of numbers. And then if we did the same sort of analysis for the US, we would see that we arrived at a Nash equilibrium where parties are not incentivized to deviate from this strategy. Okay. And so the security dilemma is fascinating because we can also substitute these terms, right, or these players, or maybe the US and China, and maybe CO2, maintain CO2 emissions and reduce. And then again, maintain, and then reduce. And I'll put an article from The Atlantic about the prisoner's dilemma and game theory and climate change. But you can see that the best scenario for both countries is that, the second best scenario for both countries is that this square right here, where both countries choose to reduce their CO2 emissions. The first best scenario is where one country chooses to maintain their CO2 emissions, and it's the other country that chooses to reduce their CO2 emissions. But they arrive at the third best outcome, or the second worst outcome, pretty consistently, and this would be the Nash equilibrium. Right, so this is a reflection of the prisoner's dilemma. And then finally, we've also discussed political philosophy at the beginning of AP Government. This goes back to AP Government days. And we can think about individual people, right? Remember, we read a bit of Hobbes. We read Hobbes, I believe, in AP World History. I didn't have you for AP World History, but maybe Ms. Jones and you read Hobbes. We can think about individual people's decisions to arm or disarm. Hobbes was trying to theorize about the origins of government, the origins of the state. And he said that before there was a political entity or a government or states, there was the law of nature where life was nasty, brutish, and short, where people, were armed and they had to take justice into their own hands. If need be, if they were wronged, they would be the ones that needed to enact justice, right? And so this payoff system, right? The state of nature, I suppose, the incentive structure that existed, people would arrive at this arm and arm incentive structure. I guess this could be utility as well, utils. I wanted to also show you that I think this is a game with, let me check, where there's only one dominant strategy. Okay, so let me see, and we can still find a Nash equilibrium even if there's only one dominant strategy. And so let's cover this arm example. Let's see what are player 2's best response to if player 1 tries to disarm. Well, player 2's best response is to disarm, I think. Yeah. And what are player 2's best response if player 1 decides to arm? Well, player 2's best response if player 1 decides to arm. This is actually unrealistic. I messed up on this, but I'm also trying to show you sort of that you don't need a dominant strategy. So player 2 does not have a dominant strategy, right? Player 2 would only have a dominant strategy if this was circled. Then we would know that player 2 would pick disarm if they were rational and if they're following game theory's advice to play your dominant strategy all the time. But for whatever reason, they do not have a dominant strategy. But player 1 pretty clearly has a dominant strategy, and we can cover up this row and see what is player 1's best payoff. It's there. And we can already see that's a Nash equilibrium. And cover up this row. What is player 1's best payoff if player 2 decides to disarm? And we can see it is to arm, right? So player 1 has a dominant strategy, and this yields a Nash equilibrium, right? Because player 1 has a dominant strategy. So it only takes one player to have a dominant strategy to find a Nash equilibrium, a situation in which neither player has a regret about the strategy that they played, right? This is probably more unrealistic, right? This play or this payoff structure probably should sort of mirror this, where both players have a dominant strategy, and we end up at this outcome. Because I think people wouldn't want to disarm in a situation where the other person remains armed. Or is that the reflection? Let me check. Player 1's. Oh no. Well, this says that player 2, if player 1 disarmed, player 2 would also want to disarm. So player 2 is like just a nicer person. They don't want the weapons just in case. So yeah, maybe this is feasible. This is pretty feasible. Sorry, I messed up. Obviously, I'm brain dead. I've been watching Shrek with these 6th graders. It's been a crazy day. And I've been watching them take a mock star test for 5 hours, so my brain is fried. Okay, so this is a Nash equilibrium. And we can find a Nash equilibrium if only one player has a dominant strategy, because we expect the other player to just know what the other player is going to play, which is their dominant strategy, and play the best response to the other player. And that best response for player 2 is here, it's to arm. And so this reflects this idea that people in a state of nature where life is nasty and brutish and short are not going to want to give up their freedoms and their arms, etc. But Hobbes says that people eventually can move away from the state of nature by entering into a social contract. And we talked about social contract theory at the beginning of AP Government. Of course, Hobbes was trying to develop, a theory about how governments originated, and it's necessarily reductive, but it's helpful bit of social theory that has had a profound impact and has been used by the framers of the Constitution, etc., and is embedded in our founding documents. This idea of a social contract between people and the state. But nonetheless, Hobbes kind of provides us with an interesting segue into thinking about how to achieve cooperation in this prisoner's dilemma type of situation. Contracts is one way. We can think about treaties, regulations. These are fundamentally attempts to change the payoffs and then punish the cheaters is also a way to change the payoffs. But you can also think about repeated play, right? If this is a iterative game, if this game is played repeatedly, and there's some hope, or better hope for cooperation, because if Iran finds out that Iraq cheated, they could potentially punish them in some way, or they could potentially, choose to produce 4 another time, and Iraq's profits would be down the tube over a prolonged period of time. But with iterative play, there's a chance for a player to punish the cheater. There's more cooperative opportunity potentially with iterative interactions, depending upon how the players choose to respond to perceived cheating. And that's important because sometimes you think someone's cheating at a game, right? Sometimes maybe Iran thinks that Iraq is increasing their production of oil, but maybe they're not, maybe it's someone else. So how do you respond to that? So there's a sort of fragility in cartels that exists, or that can exist, I should say, but there is some potential for cooperation. And so this allows us a complicated set of tools to think about how firms collude and cooperate with one another.